And Nicole, as soon as you see me pass the host back to you, we can start. All right, we are now live.
Okay. Welcome everyone to those streaming this meeting of the Essex Region Conservation Authority, and welcome colleagues, board members, as well as all of our administrative staff who are here to assist through this meeting. I will call it to order, it being 6:02. It's the 18th meeting of our of the ERCA Board of Directors, in fact, already well into our mandate. We'll start by taking a roll call similar to the last meeting. One other, actually, before we get into the roll call, I think it worked quite well for us in the last meeting, where on most of the votes, if there was anyone who wanted to articulate opposition, to just unmute your mic and state that. But for the most part, I'll just be looking for the show of hands. But if you are opposed to something, let's use that same process. And I'll do my best to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to make a motion or to second a motion as we go through the meeting here this evening. So having said that, we do have regrets from Councillor Dane Malash from Pelee Island, as well as Mayor Drew Dilkins. And we will have joining us, if they haven't already joined us, very shortly, Deputy Mayor Tracy Bailey, as well as Deputy Mayor Joe Becchetti. But having said all of that, let's go through the roll call, and I'll just ask you to articulate present after I call your name. Councillor Peter Courtney.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Marilyn Morrison.
Present.
Councillor Morley Bowman.
Present.
Councillor Chris Vanderdolen.
Present.
Councillor Laura Lucier.
Present.
Councillor Larry Patterson.
Present.
Councillor Mark Carrick.
Present.
Councillor Sue DeJarla.
Present.
Councillor John Jacobs.
Present.
Deputy Mayor Larry Verbicki.
Present.
Councillor Dane, Councillor Tanya Jobin.
Present.
Councillor Jim Morrison.
Present.
Councillor Ed Sleeman. Okay.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I think you misled Councillor Lange.
Lakeshore is here.
Lakeshore.
Lakeshore is here. Excuse me.
Thank you.
But okay, I see why I did that. Okay, Councillor Janice, you're here.
Present. Present.
Apologies, and thank you, Richard. Okay, so now that we know who's here, we'll move on to the land acknowledgement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this land is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and of all original peoples of Turtle Island, North America, who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. Do we have any declarations of pecuniary interests? Please raise your hand if there are any members who have pecuniary interest for this meeting. Seeing none, we'll move on to item number 4, approval of the agenda. Can I have a motion to, are there any questions on the agenda? No, motion to approve. I saw Councillor Janice, seconded by Councillor Patterson. Anyone opposed? Seeing none, that passes. We need adoption of the minutes now for the April 16th special meeting and regular meeting of the Board of Directors, and the recommendations therein be approved and as distributed. Can I get a motion there? Councillor DeJarla, seconded by Councillor Sleeman. Any opposed? Seeing none, that passes. Okay, we have the minutes of the May 11th, 2020 meeting from the John R. Park Homestead Advisory Board and the recommendations therein be approved as distributed. Any questions there? direction? Councillor Desjardins moving, seconded by Councillor Jobin. Any opposition? Seeing none, that passes. Business arising from the previous meeting none. There are no announcements either. So moving on to delegations. This evening, we would like to welcome two delegations to the meeting. Dr. Vicky Pardo will be presenting on behalf of a group of residents from the Gardner Crescent, and will be followed by Councillor Don MacArthur from the town of Amherstburg. I would like to invite the board to hold questions until after both parties have had an opportunity to speak. As deliberations related to legal and property matters are typically discussed in camera, administration is prepared a report for the committee of the whole. So any questions that board members may have in relation to the transfer or the potential transfer of this property or these properties, we'll save those for the committee of the whole. Anything outside of that specific scope would be fair game, I guess, with respect to questions in this forum. So Dr. Pardo, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you. So I think somebody has to, what's her name? Danielle is going to put up the PowerPoint for me. I don't have control of the screen, so somebody's going to be moving the slides for me.
Yeah, we're just getting that set up now, Dr. Pardo.
Okay. You can call me Vicky. I just put my official title up there. Screen share is currently disabled.
This probably worked great in rehearsal, so bear with us a moment here, if you would.
Just to be,
Yes, I practiced with Nicole this morning.
for some reason, the screen share is currently disabled. Obviously, we're working on that.
Sorry, my apologies. I'm going to try to, as we work to resolve this, I'd like to be able to move the meeting ahead, and I'm just going to try to pull up the presentation at this time. So if you could just give me a quick minute here, I'll arrange to share the screen. Thank you for your patience.
Here we go.
Wonderful. I had full confidence in you, Nicole. Vicky,
All right, are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll say it again. Hello, my name is Dr. Vicky Pardo. I would like to thank the chair and the members of the board for allowing me to represent the Gardner Crescent Neighborhood Group, as I will be speaking on behalf of my friends and neighbors today. Okay, hang on. Move my slide too. Okay, so we have next slide, please. We have three objectives for this presentation. We would like to give everyone an increased understanding of this unique section of the ERCA Trail. We'd like to discuss three different scenarios regarding the purchase price of this land, and we would like to find an equitable resolution that will benefit all of the involved parties. Next slide, please. So let's start with the historical perspective to describe the events of the past 25 years. Early in the mid-1990s, it was a verbal promise by Gardner, the developer, of one day having the opportunity to buy the abandoned railway land behind our properties. In 1995, the Canada Southern Railway stated that there were no plans for the abandoned property and that residents were free to do as we wanted on those properties. We then received permission from both the township and the developer to move forward with improvements to the lots at our own expense. This included clearing dense brush, grading and sodding of the boggy grounds, maintenance and cleanup of the rear yards and the original trail, and planting trees and shrubs. In 2004, the abandoned railway property was transferred to ERCA, and Gardner residents were blindsided by this news at the March 9th ERCA meeting. We were not considered or offered the opportunity to buy the land at the rear of our properties, as was verbally promised in the past. In 2008, we received a letter from Kevin Money. It stated that we had to stop mowing and caring for the ERCA property or agree to pay an annual lease so that we could mow the ERCA land at the rear of our properties. Two neighbors immediately opted for the lease, but this was revoked shortly thereafter. Next slide, please. There were two separate meetings held in September of 2008, the Amherstburg Town Hall meeting and a public meeting by ERCA. There were no clear results or actions from these meetings, and our group was left very disillusioned. 8 years later, we received a letter from Kevin Money about the opportunity to purchase the property at the rear of our lots. Many of us expressed interest, but again, there was no further communication from ERCA. In the spring of 2018, my neighbor, Tony DiPetrangelo, spoke with Kevin Money during a tree planting program along the ERCA trail. At that time, Kevin stated that the cost of purchasing the property would be 65 cents a square foot and that we would hear from them shortly. Once again, we received no further communication. On May 29th, 2019, we held a neighborhood meeting to revisit ERCA's previous offer. Two members of the Amherstburg Town Council and Kevin Money were present. When I asked Kevin for an approximate cost to each of us for purchasing the land, he stated it would be no more than $1,000 to $2,000. We received an email from Kevin on May 31st, which included the MacIver report. It was the first time we saw it. The price to purchase the land was $4.25 a square foot for the smaller lots and $2.15 a square foot for the larger lots. This was revised in a later email from Kevin stating that all of the lots were now valued at $4.25 a square foot for some reason. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to present three different scenarios at the different price points, and please note that we are using the 25-foot depth for these values. At the price of $4.25 a square foot, there are two residents who are committed to buying the property. This would result in ERCA receiving over $16,000. The photo depicts what this would look like. Please picture long grass and weeds growing at the red line at the back of the other properties. We were informed by Kevin Money that if those 6 owners continued to cut the grass, then a fence would be erected to keep the ERCA property natural and not groomed. Picture a fence that follows this red line. I don't think it's very natural or visually appealing to us or the greenway users. Also consider the cost to ERCA of erecting this fence and maintaining it in the future. Next slide, please. At $2.15 a square foot, there are 7 residents who are committed to buying the property. The grand total that ERCA would receive from that sale is over $32,000. Next slide, please. The final scenario is at a price of $2 a square foot. Even though we were told at one point that the cost would be 65 cents a square foot, we have chosen not to present this scenario since we understand that this is for rural zoning and that we are residential. We were recently notified by another homeowner further down the greenway that he was told his cost to buy land adjacent to the greenway would be $2 a square foot. So we have chosen this price as our best fit for everyone involved. At $2 a square foot, there could be 9 residents who are committed to buying the property. The grand total that ERCA would receive from that sale is over $40,000. Next slide, please. So we are in a unique situation, and the direct comparison method to the other 8 properties that were used by the MacIver report is not appropriate. All of those properties can be developed, while we will not be able to erect any permanent structures since it will be zoned open space. ERCA has requested to retain the subsurface rights for utilities, and we have agreed to this stipulation. We have no problem with that. This means that they want us to pay top dollar for a property that we cannot build on. We don't own the whole property, just the grassy surface. And very important, no one else will ever be able to buy this landlocked parcel of land. The fluctuations in the information given to us about the cost of this land have been baffling. Using myself as an example, I have been told at the 65 cents a square foot, it's a total for me of $1,279. When I asked Kevin Money for a ballpark of what he thought it would be, he said no more than $1,000 to $2,000. And then with the MacGyver report, it was $4.25 a square foot, over $8,000. Okay. These high prices have essentially priced out several members of our group. We hope to regain their interest at the more reasonable valuations. At $4.25 a square foot, ERCA will receive over $16,000 from 2 homeowners. At $2.15 a square foot, ERCA will receive over $32,000 from 7 homeowners. And at $2 a square foot, ERCA could receive over $40,000 from 9 homeowners. Also, ERCA does not pay property taxes to the town of Amherstburg for this property. However, there will be a significant amount of yearly property taxes paid to the town of Amherstburg by 2 or 7 or 9 homeowners if we purchase the property at a reasonable price. So there are 3 different scenarios and only one where everyone wins, in my opinion. So next slide, please. Okay, so we consider this a win-win-win situation. ERCA will receive an influx of money that can be used to fund other important programs. ERCA will solidify a positive relationship with its neighbors adjacent to the Greenway. The town of Amherstburg will benefit financially from the increased property taxes that we will be paying on the new property. The Gardner Crescent Group, who I must say are a wonderful group of neighbors who are long-standing residents of Amherstburg, would finally get an equitable resolution after 25 long years of promises and delays. Our group will continue to be good stewards of the land for years to come. Thank you very much for your attention and consideration of our proposal.
Thank you, Vicki. We also have Councillor Don MacArthur joining us this evening. Is Don with us? I don't see him.
Can you hear me, Kieran?
Oh, there you go. Yep.
Oh, here, there.
There you go, Don.
Yeah.
Okay, Councillor, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McKenzie. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear virtually, I guess, as a delegate tonight. It's much appreciated. And I would like to begin by commending the Essex Region Conservation Authority for the tremendous work you do promoting and maintaining the Greenway. It's a vital community asset. We've seen that during this pandemic. You know, people, physical and mental wellness, they can get outdoors, they can exercise safely while physically distancing. I've been jogging on it, walking my dogs on it, cycling on it. Last night, I snapped a picture at sunset, shared it on social, and ERCA retweeted it. So thank you for that. It's a community jewel, and we should be promoting it. So, you know, as you're aware by now, I'm here tonight to discuss a small portion of that trail as it relates to a small group of Amherstburg residents who love that trail as much as I do and as much as ERCA does. They're seeking to purchase a narrow portion of that land, and ERCA is amenable to selling it to them. I mean, in fact, one of your appraisal reports says that the highest and best use of that land would be dispose of it to sell it to the residents. The sticking point appears to be price. We've just heard that from Dr. Pardo, and I'm just encouraging the board to you know, to take a broad look at this and try to come to a compromise that benefits all parties, the residents, trail users, ERCA, and the taxpayers who fund it. The history of this file, as we've just heard, is long and winding, and I think it predates, obviously, ownership of the trail by ERCA. And I think it's safe to say that the residents are a little bit disillusioned, disappointed, and frustrated. There's an opportunity tonight to take that, put that all in the past and move forward, you know, on a mutual foundation of goodwill. And I just hope that we can accomplish that tonight. It would represent a positive development after years of fits and starts. It would enrich ERCA's coffers, and it would encourage a sort of shared environmental stewardship ERCA is keen to promote. It all hinges, in my view, on the uniqueness of these properties. The valuations offered by the appraisers for ERCA do not adequately account for the unique circumstances surrounding these parcels of land. Nor, and I think this is very important, they don't account for the greater good that can be accomplished and that would be engendered by a sale in this case. Exceptional cases call for exceptional circumstances. and this is an exceptional case. The comparator parcels examined do not abut a trail, many of them. They're not long and narrow in shape. They can be developed. There are no easements, and they could potentially be sold to any number of bidders, inflating the value on the open market. That's not the case with these properties. They can't be developed, and really, they can only be sold to the homeowners on Gardner Crescent. The thing that sort of most concerns me about all of this is all the wasted energy and effort over decades, 25 years, emails, reports. It will all have been for naught if a resolution can't be reached here. The residents will be dissatisfied. ERCA will miss a potential windfall, and I don't think the public will benefit. You just heard Dr. Pardo go through the numbers that if the board can see, to reach some sort of a compromise with these residents, ERCA could potentially gain $40,000 that could be used for important initiatives like fighting climate change or planting trees and, putting additional benches and facilities on the trail. Put that money to good work. And I understand that, administration, they have to follow policies. Administration's just doing their job. The board sort of has a different job. You can look at the broader circumstances. You can try to advocate that the greater good for the greatest number is done in that case. And I think reaching a compromise resolution with these residents would accomplish this. And I appreciate, where administration's coming from in the sense that you don't want to set a precedent, that would somehow imperil ERCA's future dealings with landowners. But the circumstances in this case are so unique that that's not going to happen. The only precedent that you guys would set if you reach a deal with these residents is that of a reasonable board willing to make a reasonable accommodation when it makes sense and when it's in the public interest to do so. I think that if you guys can resolve this long-standing issue and find common ground with these residents, it's going to yield a substantial financial benefit for ERCA without harming the trail or ERCA's future negotiations with other landowners, and it would engender considerable goodwill with these residents who have long been faithful stewards of the trail. It would be a win for ERCA, a win for the residents, a win for the town, and a win for the trail. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. At this point, I'll open the floor up to board members. Are there any questions for the delegates? Ms. Morrison.
Thank you. I would just like to ask, are all 9 residents on side for the purchase?
I'm not sure if that would be Ms.
I had to unmute myself. Well, yeah, I said could, right? Because people have been very disillusioned. It is definitely 7 people at the 2. And the other 2 people just washed their hands of it and were so frustrated. But I believe if we can show this goodwill, I have a feeling that there's a very good chance at the $2 that all of us will be able to purchase that. It became too much money at the $4.25 a square foot.
Well, I would just like to say that from my perspective, it makes common sense since these lands can't be used for anything else. I think it would be a good gesture of goodwill. And I would, when we get to that point, I'd be happy to move a motion that we sell it for the $2 a square foot.
So and thank you for your comments, Ms. Morrison. We're going to deal with the transfer of the land and the committee of the whole portion of it. But right now we're just sticking to questions of the delegates. We'll move on to questions of our administration once everyone's had an opportunity to ask questions of the delegates, if there are any more.
Okay.
Councillor Lucier.
Thank you. I'm just not really knowing the history of these parcels of land. Is there an issue with it being mowed versus being naturalized?
So I'm going to assume that would have been that'd be a question for Mr. Mooney. I don't know, Ms. Pardo, if you want to comment on just the state of that land as it is.
As it is, the reason we've been keeping care of the grass and cutting the grass, it gets very long, lots of insects. There's a lot of issues. People have little kids and grandkids. when it encroaches like that, it can be a big issue. There is a ditch there that holds some water. So between that water and the long grass, the bugs get very bad, and it doesn't look very good. We have been keeping that land pristine. It looks natural. And that was our reason for doing it. We were told in the beginning we were allowed to do what we wanted, and then we were told don't mow it, but then we didn't hear anything back. So we have been taking care of the land because we never heard anything definitive. So that's our side of it.
Supplemental, please.
Yeah.
I'm just curious from ERCA's perspective, whether ERCA's okay with that being mown grass as opposed to, you know, more naturalized. I assume this is between the homeowner's property and the trail.
There is, if you look back at the one map, so basically there would be long grass, then a ditch, and then it raises up, and then the greenway is raised. So there's a fair bit of space between that we would not own. We would not own we are looking to buy that 25 feet between the end of our property and just at the ditch. So the ditch and then the hill, that would be in between. And that hill and the ditch is all natural.
Thank you.
Councilor Lucier, I'll ask, or once we get through the questions to the delegates, we'll have Mr. Mooney respond to that question as
Okay.
well. But is there anyone else
Thank you.
who has a question from to other than delegates? Councilor Jacobs?
Thank you, Chair. Just out of curiosity here, like Kevin came in at a price of 65 cents originally, then went to $4.25 to $2. Who and how are these appraisals made? Is there, because there's such a variance from one end to the other here.
Okay, so that sounds like another question for administration. Ms. Pardo, you already sort of walked us through that history as well. So again, I'll just ask if we have a question, we'll come back to that. We'll hear Mr. Mooney respond to that. When he I just want to make sure that everyone who wants to ask a question of the delegates, either Ms. Pardo or Councillor MacArthur, that they ask those questions, and then we'll move on to our administration.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't see any further questions for the delegates. So I'm going to assume, Mr. Mooney, you heard the two questions from Ms. Lucier, or from Councillor Lucier and Councillor Jacobs. I'm going to assume it's Mr. Mooney, or perhaps yes. Okay, I see Richard shaking, nodding in agreement. So Mr. Mooney.
Yes, Chair.
Kevin, did you hear the two questions that were asked of regarding, if you would maybe provide a comment in response to the question of mowing versus naturalization, and the history just briefly, without getting into a lot of details with respect to the final appraisal that was undertaken.
Yeah, absolutely. Through you, Chair, the use along many other sections of the greenway associated with this is it's a naturalized corridor, and it's there for habitat for many wildlife species. That is the ultimate goal associated with many of these properties and other locations. To answer Councillor Lucier's comment or question, our preference would be that this is maintained as natural habitat and is a buffer between the homes and the trail.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mooney. I think that there's a number of the board members that are sort of waving, and I think it's the same issue. Or is everyone having trouble hearing Mr. Mooney? I'm not sure what we can do.
Yes.
Okay. It's barely audible at this point, and I'm not sure if it's just an internet connection issue where you're at, but we're all experiencing the same thing.
Okay, my apologies. What I can do is try to log out and log back in again if the board would like on a different signal. Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you, but again, it's very choppy and it's really hard to understand.
Okay.
Maybe as a first step, if I could, perhaps Kevin, maybe turn off your video to see if that has any improvement, if it's just your audio.
Yeah, I can try doing that and speak closer to the mic if anybody can hear me better. No?
Not really.
it hasn't improved very much. So
Maybe, Mr. Chair, if I could interpret a little bit of what Kevin was saying, that the ideal goal with the Greenway, because it does provide an important connection from a natural area perspective. So in fact, in a lot of cases along our entirety of the Greenway, we have it naturalized, and in some cases in those naturalized portions, we're actually eligible to receive land tax incentives because it provides habitat, especially habitat for endangered species. When those sections of trail are actually mowed and maintained, they're no longer eligible for some of those conservation land taxes. So in fact, we do pay taxes on those properties, as was noted from Ms. Pardo. The properties that we don't receive tax benefits from municipalities for our lands unless there is a conservation easement, or sorry, a conservation incentive, in which case we can apply to the provincial government from that perspective. So you know, we do in all cases try to maintain it as natural as possible because it provides that habitat connection and because it does provide some of that opportunity. And if I may, hopefully Kevin, maybe you can rejoin us to talk a little bit about, if we can, just from a clarity perspective, the final appraisal that was undertaken did provide that number. Kevin, are you? Let's see if you're back again.
Sorry, I apologize about this. Can anybody hear me better?
it's pretty much the same, Kevin, or Mr. Mooney is, and I mean, we could try to struggle through it. It's hard to listen to, though, to be frank. So, Richard, I'm not sure what you.
Well, and I can speak finally, because everything that we do as a board or as a conservation authority, and it was referenced, I think, by Councillor MacArthur, when we do transactions, whether it be an acquisition or a disposition, our practice and policy and direction from the board has always been to do that through a confirmed appraisal. And so that's the process that we've always worked through. We did have a report to the board a couple of years ago that was referenced, and we can talk about that a little bit further in the committee as a whole. It provided us that direction in this instance as well to seek an appraisal, which we did do, and that was the appraisal that came back at that $4.25. There was back and forth and interaction in response to questions from the group to the appraiser. We, again, don't get involved in that. The expertise lies with the appraiser. We provided the responses back from the appraiser to the group in response to the questions that they were asked. So again, we don't get into a practice of, from an administrative perspective, we don't get into a practice of negotiating or of anything other than working with appraised values, because it does set not only a precedent, but it does potentially inflate or deflate property values, whether we're involved in an acquisition or disposition, and could in fact question some of the past transactions that we've done as well, in that it does set that precedent.
Okay.
Are there any further questions? Are there any further questions of our administration?
If I could, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Jacobs.
Thank you. Richard, I appreciate you saying that the appraisal came in at $4.25. Then how did we get to $2? I guess that's where my confusion lies with this. You went from 65 cents, 4 1/4, and then down to 2. And you said appraisal was at 4 1/4.
So Councillor, I'm gonna step in there. I feel like that's an issue that we're going to deal with when we get into the committee of the whole.
Okay.
It is dealt with in the report that was made public and distributed to the residents, how they arrived at that. And Richard, I'll defer to you if you think it's appropriate to answer, but in my mind, it's a property disposition matter, and I think it's best if we dealt with that in the committee of the whole.
That's fine with me, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Vander Dolen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you, how many other places along our greenways are already narrowed by having sold off or not acquired the original width? And what's the potential number of people who would want to seek a similar deal if we approve this one? There must be hundreds and hundreds of residential lots that abut our greenways all through the county. I know of one area on that that Cipher Systems Greenway that it looks like somebody, I don't think they purchased the property. I think they may have obtained it through through basically squatting on it. But I don't think any of it has been sold. Have we sold any, and how many potential bids would we get on,
Sure,
on this?
If I may, Mr. Chair, in this section of Greenway, I don't believe we've sold any portions to neighboring lands at this point. On the Chrysler Canada Greenway, there has been some situations, or were some situations where a similar situation arose. And I can speak as an example, what we call the Kingsville Spur, the line, the extension of the Greenway that runs essentially from Medawa's restaurant down to the docks in Kingsville. That was a specific situation where there were a number of properties, about 6 or 8, very similar situation, very narrow rear yards where same process, lands were appraised and made available to those residents if they were interested in acquiring those lands. That's one example. There was a couple of other smaller examples along those stretches of land where there were some similar transactions that were done, again, in keeping with that policy from the board.
Thank you, Mr. Wyman. I meant to say earlier, I think Mr. Mooney and his neighborhood should apply for some of that SWIFT money for better internet. Thanks.
Further questions, any board members? Councillor Carrick.
Thank you. Just some clarification. So we're told them that the appraisal was $4 or something a square foot. I'm not talking, I don't want to care about money right now, but just need some differentiation between now we were talking about the drain itself as being needed. So why would we be offering to sell it? That's all I need some clarification around that, because we're talking about keeping it natural, then we want to sell it. So just some clarification around that.
Through you, Chair, Mr. Money has rejoined. If you'd like me to answer this question.
Oh, Kevin, yeah, you sound very clear. So
okay.
yeah, please proceed.
My apologies. I'm using my phone now. To try to answer that question, sir, ultimately, the Conservation Authority was invited to a neighborhood meeting in 2019 by the drainage superintendent and a few municipal councilors for the town of Amherstburg to deal with some drainage concerns that the landowners had behind the house, their house, and along the greenway. So the original issue was associated with drainage, but obviously the landowners brought up concerns or a desire to speak to land acquisition. Within the report, which I recognize the delegates don't actually have, it does contain the email that was sent to them that spoke to both of those issues. The issue of drainage was very quickly dropped, and the issue of land acquisition became front and center with the residents.
Thank you, Mr. Money. Are there any further questions of our administration? Councillor Courtney.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, probably either to Kevin or Richard, you said that there has been other parcels of land abutting to the Greenway that have been sold. Are we seeking appraisals for each individual landowner that's looking to do this? Has there been any varying costs? And I guess further to that, maybe for Dr. Pardo, you heard someone down the Greenway was able to purchase land for $2 a square foot. I don't know if that's factual or not, if administration can give us light on
that. Through you, Chair. The last point, I would consider that inaccurate. We have not sold parcels for $2 a square foot anywhere along the Cipher Systems Greenway to any landowner. I'm sorry, can you repeat the first part of your question, sir?
Just in regards to other land acquisitions or parcels abutting the Greenway, are we seeking appraisals for each individual piece of land, or generic formula that we can come to the conclusion with the value of the land, this deadlocked space? Again, because my concern is in regards to this appraisal, it's got the 3. It went from a very generic ratio of undeveloped rural, developed urban, and then it specified specifically the Gardner Crescent, which I don't understand why they would specify that. It is either, you can't build on it. So is there any clarification on that? Is there a set standard, or is it always fluctuating? Is it based on the location of the property, the depth of the property? Because it was also cited as 30-foot depth of their backyards, and this would enhance the value of their property. So I'm just clarification on that.
Yep. Through you, Chairman. We've only actually sold parcels of abutting greenway land to neighboring landowners in one other instance, and that's been in Kingsville. We are in the process of working with one landowner in McGregor to do a bit of a land exchange in keeping with the other board report that was presented in the in-camera from a few years ago. And in this particular instance, we tried to instruct the appraiser to focus in on key areas to deal with specific issues where we knew where there was a number of encroachments along the greenway. So that was the primary focus of this appraisal, was that we could hone in on these specific areas like Gardner Crescent, as well as many of the agricultural properties and focus on those. The agricultural properties that were encroachments, we did not provide opportunities for any of those landowners that were encroaching onto our property to actually purchase. We did not provide them any form of an agreement to purchase. And this is only the second time we've provided this offer.
Further to that, so there's been no other appraisals done for any other landowner for any of these transactions? This is the first time that you guys have had hard numbers sent to you in regards to the value of the land?
No, if I could maybe step in, when we did the transaction in Kingsville, that was done with an appraiser. There were, as I mentioned, a couple of lots, or 4 or 5 or 6 lots that were there. So it was an appraisal of that section of land, similar to this, where it was an appraisal done for a specific portion of the community. And it was based on how the appraisers do their processes based on comparables and otherwise. So in that instance, absolutely, there were appraisals that were done. Lands were exchanged based on that appraised value.
And without divulging, was the price comparable? Was it different? And if it was different, why so?
Those lands were probably sold off back in I want to say the early 2000s. So there's been significant time since then. So it's unfair to compare land values from then to now.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other board members who have questions of our administration at this point? Ms. Morrison.
I would just like to know if ERCA is now providing the opportunity. Earlier, staff said that they would like it to remain untouched. So why are they providing the opportunity now then? If they want it untouched, why wouldn't it be nothing is going to happen to it? It remains the way it is. And my other question would be, why has staff not gone in if they wanted it to remain untouched? Why haven't they gone in and rolled people back from cutting it and maintaining it? Because if it's a natural corridor for animals and things, then there should have been a no touch. I don't quite understand, what's going on.
I can speak generally to that, Ms. Morrison. Again, when there is, as you mentioned, the interest in these lands is from the neighbors. ERCA they're not landlocked. These are lands that are attached to the greenway. So if they're not acquired, they would simply remain greenway lands. We have, as was expressed by Ms. Pardo and others, shared correspondence that said we do want to have these lands kept as ERCA, remove the encroachments as we've talked about. That's when we got into some of these discussions with respect to land exchange or land transfer and acquisition, I should say. So the process has been that. In terms of why we haven't stopped something from happening, it would have required a fence to be installed, and we haven't gone through that step yet because we are working through these processes with the Gardner Crescent landowners.
But the process we're working through is potentially selling it. If we have no interest in selling it and we want it to remain naturalized, then why would we even consider a process of selling?
This was at the request of some landowners that have very narrow backyards and rear yards, and it was an opportunity to show good neighbor and maybe enter into a process where we could improve upon neighboring land, and neighbors could benefit from the additional space because they are very tight rear yards and side yards, as was expressed, and this provides an opportunity for them to do that. So we were willing to entertain that discussion rather than go through the process of dealing with the encroachment.
So if we would like it to be naturalized, have we thought of, and staff have probably thought of this, of instead of selling off 25 or 30 feet, sell off half the width?
Kevin, are you able to respond to that one?
Through you, Chair. We have had those discussions, absolutely, and there were a few scenarios discussed at the administrative level. Ultimately, the decision to sell or offer to sell to these individual landowners was exactly that. It was based on the narrow rear yards and the continual encroachment that was occurring. It was an ability to try to deal with this in a more neighborly fashion than putting up a fence. And in most instances, and even just down the road, we have already naturalized some sections. So we're trying to come to a solution here that was a little more friendly for these residents, given the narrow depth of their backyard. That's kind of the rationale why, and that was in keeping with the past board report that is in your committee, the whole report. And we did look at different depth scenarios, and we landed on 25 feet as an appropriate amount that would still provide a buffer between the trail users and the backyards.
Do we maintain our trail along the edges?
Through you, Chairman, we do maintain a narrow width on either side of the trail, but the properties that we're talking about, those areas would normally be naturalized and let go.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One final question, probably to Dr. Pardo. When you purchased the land, I don't know how long you've been a resident there. Obviously, you get all the legalities, you get the deed, you get the lot size, the lot coverage. I know that there was developer promise. Promises don't mean anything. We all know that. So understanding aside, outside of ERCA, because this sounds like this was before ERCA got their hands on it and it was donated land for the rail company, there was an understanding that your property you bought knowing that in theory you would only have 30-foot backyard, correct?
Am I allowed to answer?
We're going to make a procedural exception in this case, but yeah, absolutely. Please proceed, because I know Ms. Pardo, you wanted to get in, and I was going to ask you if there was anything you wanted to add at the end of the debate. Anyway, so please, if there's things you want to say that you still want to say, just go ahead.
Okay. So first question, we built our house 24 years ago. Paula is 25 years ago. So I think the oldest house in this neighborhood is about 26 years old. And so the history of the whole thing was, you know, as I told you guys, the thing is, I wanted to clarify the $2, that is someone down on the Greenway. They did not purchase, but I was just walking my dogs down the Greenway like I do every night. And I was chatting with them and they said that they were offered $2 a square foot for their little piece of property between their house and the Greenway. Nothing was ever purchased, nothing was in writing. Many of these things that I told you about in the history were just, the only thing that's in writing has been the emails with Kevin and the report, the McIver report. Everything else was just verbal. You know, oh, it'd be about $1,000 to $2,000. Oh, it's this, it's that. Another thing I just wanted to point out was that the McIver report initially said that I think 2 or 3 of the larger properties of the 9 properties the price would be $2.15 a square foot. And then the rest of us, because we were smaller properties, would be the $4.25. And so we thought, well, that's kind of odd. And there was a reason for it because of the size of our lots. But then arbitrarily, they just said, nope, across the board, everyone's going to be $4.25, which there was never an explanation for that. So those people who originally could have bought for $2.15 were suddenly jumped up, doubled their price. So I think that answers all of the questions. So we've been here a very long time, and there have been so many different stories about what the possibilities are with that land back there. Nothing was, you're correct, nothing was ever in writing that we will get to buy that land. We've heard from several different sources, yes, it's coming, right? And then we kept getting blindsided, and it's been a 25-year story of trying to figure this out.
Okay.
I hope that answers all the questions and clarifies things.
Thank you, Dr. Pardo. Any last questions for our administration on this issue? And as I mentioned, board members, we are going to deal with this in committee of the whole later on this evening. Seeing none, I want to thank Dr. Pardo as well as Councillor MacArthur for your presentations here this evening. Thank you for joining us and making time and bringing these issues forward. I don't think we need a motion here. We'll continue on to the reports for approval. So item 11, the update from ERCA's programs and services in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Richard, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to keep this brief. We did try to be as descriptive as possible in the reports. You know, we're all as municipalities and councillors, you know, trying to respond to the ever-changing nature of provincial direction and otherwise. And so we've been keeping up to date on all of those directives that have come through in terms of essential services, non-essential services. As a matter of an update, we had some discussions, but in mid-May, I guess, the province did allow for seasonal campsites to open first for preparation and then following for overnight camping. So that's now been opened up at Holiday Beach, and we went through risk assessments and we went through an updated procedures and policies with seasonal campers to ensure that, again, we can keep ourselves safe as well as campers safe and other visitors to the park safe. Our offices do still remain closed to the public, and we're working with, and I'll be meeting again with the county who runs the Civic Center in terms of what their processes might be regarding that timeline for potential office opening. But having said that, like every other municipality, there's certainly been no stoppage of work when it comes to the responsibilities that we do continue to deliver. Our watershed management services continue to be increased. We're still getting numbers higher than they have been in previous years. The restriction on development that was put forward by the province didn't seem to impact us because of the high water levels and the amounts of especially shoreline permits and shoreline management permits that we did go through. But we are anticipating, because of release of some of the delays regarding committee meetings and things like that from a planning perspective, municipalities are opening those up again now. So we are anticipating that we're going to be seeing more and more planning applications as well coming through, which we're setting ourselves up to respond to. You know, we have, as we've tried to be clear through our social media and in corresponding with everyone here, we have continued to keep our site programming closed. We are canceling events, you know, as it relates to some of the direction that we're getting in terms of physical distancing and otherwise. We're broadly looking at all of our operating procedures and risk assessments for all of our operations, both within the Civic Center as well as at conservation areas, as it relates to cleaning, as it relates to PPE, as it relates to even providing directions on where people might go from a trails perspective, so that we can try to reduce the interaction between trail users, as an example. So we're going quite thorough into all of the protocols, you know, that we have to deal with. We have, in May, we did make some changes from a staffing perspective. We reduced staff work hours and work weeks fairly across the board. That bill was further to the 2.5-hour reduction that we did make. We did go through and there were 6 staff that were temporarily laid off. At the same time, we did put forward a proposal to our QP that we would look at returning or creating 3 temporary conservation area tech positions And it worked out in that 3 of the laid off, temporarily laid off staff, applied, if you will, for those positions, and so are working and continue to work now in the conservation area, maintenance and operations side of things, which again, as was noted by Councillor MacArthur, continues to be very heavily used and well used in terms of our trails and conservation areas. Finally, we are, now again looking at what is that. We hesitate to call it a return to work or return to office plan because nothing has stopped. We're not returning to anything. We're planning for the new normal, if you will, in terms of what is that phased approach that might see us reopening portions of our office, or what sections might be opening sooner rather than later to receive, for instance, public guests or appointments and those types of things. How do we sort those things through? How do we outline some of those conditions, and how do we consider things like work schedules and alternating days off so that we can try to reduce staff numbers and limit or at least to facilitate some of that social distancing. So again, we've been working and discussions with the county. We've also been sharing a lot of our practices with other conservation authorities in terms of how we're approaching some of these situations, and we will continue to do so.
Thank you, Richard. Any questions on Richard's report? Seeing none, I think we need a motion to receive. Councillor Courtney, seconded by Councillor Lucier. Anyone opposed? Seeing none, that passes. Moving on to BD 1620. Stimulating a more resilient, sustainable, and green economy. Once again, Richard.
And again, I will keep this brief because I know everyone is, at least municipalities, have been hearing more and more about some of the opportunities for stimulus funding that may be coming through, specifically as it relates to some of the projects and programs that we deliver. There's been an acknowledgement that nothing's yet been finalized, but it looks like there may be opportunities from a green infrastructure perspective where there may be a significant portion, up to 80% of that could be funded through federal efforts. We've been looking at that with some of our, again, with our municipal and county colleagues as it relates specifically to things like hazard mapping, which we know we've brought up here before. It's been reflected in the flood advisors report, as well as the flooding strategy, the need to update these flood and hazard maps. There's a very good opportunity potentially to maybe access some of those funds for that, as there are for some of the other green infrastructure supports. I do sit on, as the report mentioned, a working group of Conservation Ontario that's trying to build the case for investment in stimulus funding for conservation authorities. I look as an example at our WECI funding, our water and erosion control infrastructure funding. We were successful at getting a portion of one project funded this year. There were $19 million worth of asks around the province for $5 million worth of funds. There's clearly some opportunities there for investment in those shovel-ready projects that would be very important as it relates to flood and flood management. And so again, we're proposing those types of things would be top of mind, in addition to some of the activities that we do along our stewardship initiatives with Lake Erie and phosphorus, along our flood and shoreline management programs, and other areas where there may be opportunity, even from a recreational perspective, to benefit from maybe investing in some of these. And municipalities, again, have all made application under some of these investing in Canada programs with Ontario and the federal government last year. Again, there's some great opportunities for support from our senior levels of government as it relates to stimulus funding. And our argument, I guess, what we're putting forward is that over the last 3 or 4 months, things have become a little greener, things have become a little clearer, water has become clearer, air has become clearer. Maybe we can try to build on some of those successes through stimulus and actually build that into a more stronger program going forward, because as research has shown, in many cases, investment in this green infrastructure actually provides more employment and has a far lesser cost, both in terms of implementation and ongoing maintenance and operations, than some of the gray alternatives. So why not take this opportunity to rebuild in a greener fashion?
Thank you, Richard. Any questions for Richard on this report? Councillor Sleeman. Councillor Sleeman, you need to, can you unmute? Councillor? There you go. Okay, so we still, it looks like you're unmuted, but we still can't hear you. No. Perhaps the volume on his microphone? Councillor, could you maybe, could you type your question into the chat? We still can't hear you, Councillor. Is there a, I'm gonna ask Nicole, is there anything that on your end that you can see, or any that on our end that we can see that's
I unfortunately, there's nothing, I don't have any control over that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reach out to Councillor Sleeman and try to collect his question, and I'll type it into the chat as if I can reach him by phone.
Okay. Actually, in the meantime, I did have a question on this one, and perhaps we could come back to Councillor Sleeman. Richard, it just reading this report, and I think that our conservation authority, as well as every conservation authority across Canada, is looking to leverage all of the senior government dollars that could potentially be available. What I'm thinking about, what I've been thinking about in all of the different roles, is where the kind of where the puck might be going on all of this in a post-pandemic, and to what extent is that mindset sort of, you know, permeating the discussions that the folks in the conservation authority sort of sector are having? Where do we see senior government level dollars perhaps being redirected, given what the new economy might look like as we're coming through this, and where are those opportunities?
Sure. So part of the reason why we set up the working group through Conservation Ontario was that some conservation authorities were actually getting questions from, especially the federal government, around what types of projects would you have if there were stimulus funding made available. So Ontario is unique in that we have conservation authorities. We understand the interest, and certainly in the opportunities that, as I mentioned with the federal grant, they're looking for very quick returns on some of those projects, very quick implementation periods on some of those projects. There's no better group than a conservation authority to help them implement those things, because we are on the ground, we have the programs, we have the supports and the networks in place that we can deliver these initiatives. And so that's the message that we've been sharing with our federal and provincial counterparts, and with our federal and provincial MPs and MPPs and ministers and otherwise, as was evidenced in the letter there. You know, we share that interest in wanting to get things done as soon as possible. We've got a demonstrated track record, a demonstrated history on these types of green and stewardship initiatives, that we are the best able to deliver those projects on behalf of our residents and on behalf of our communities. So we're hearing little bits of those, and certainly the interest in as we've observed the potential of access some of those green infrastructure funds and making some of that available in the short term, at up to 80% federal funding. I think that shows a real interest from the federal government to find projects that they can implement immediately. And so essentially our sales pitch is, we're here, we're ready, we've got projects ready to go, we're ready to implement them as soon as we get them in place, or initiate them as soon as we get them in place.
Okay. So it looks like Nicole's been able to speak directly to Councillor Sleeman. I'll just read the question as it's posted in our chat. We have $20 million from the province. Mr. Sleeman was asking how much of that is related to Windsor Essex.
So I believe Mr. Sleeman may be referring to, as I mentioned, WECI, Water and Erosion Control Infrastructure dollars. There were $19 million of asks amongst all 36 conservation authorities in Ontario. We actually received, and I don't have the number right in hand, but it was a very small portion of that into, I believe it was less than $50,000 for part of a project in Bell River. We are still on the waiting list for potential if there's drop off from some of the other projects that some of our other projects may go ahead. Projects that have been funded in the past through WECI, like some of the projects on Grand Mare Strain, were not approved this year for some reason at this point. We're trying to seek some of that clarification. But so out of that 19 million, only a small portion has come to Windsor Essex. Our argument again is that those, the other 14 million that isn't funded through the 5 million provincially, those are all really good projects that have all been demonstrated and shown that they're needed to be delivered. Their studies, their initiatives, their projects, their built works, they're all of these things that really line up well with what the intentions are of getting projects done quickly and in a hurry. So again, there's a real good opportunity to invest into infrastructure and the studies that support the infrastructure that would deal directly with some of the flooding issues that we in our region are facing and others in Ontario as well.
Are there any further questions of Richard or administration from board members? Seeing none, we do have a recommended motion from our administration. I'll just read it. That ERCA encourage post-COVID economic stimulus programs. Oh, there we go. It's on the screen for you to read. Stimulus programs support natural infrastructure and a more resilient, sustainable, and green economy, and further that administration work with Conservation Ontario, municipalities, and other partners to identify shovel-ready projects in preparation for stimulus funding. I don't see the full screen here. So, Councillor Jacobs, are you moving the administration recommendation? Okay, do we have a seconder?
Second, Councillor Janice.
Councillor Janice, thank you. Anyone have any points they want to raise on this? Any discussion here? Seeing none, anyone opposed? Seeing none, that motion passes. Okay, BD 1720, the Windsor Essex Climate Change Collaborative Update. Dr. Sanders, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Windsor Essex Climate Change Collaborative was created over a year ago now from the need to respond regionally to flooding, shoreline erosion, infrastructure failure, threats to our ecosystem, and other issues that we're seeing across the region. So through this collaborative, ERCA has initiated a number of sector-based implementation teams, and we are helping to develop a climate smart restoration program for the region, which means we're essentially reviewing our tree species choices and utilization of genetic diversity via local and non-local seed source for our restoration programs. That essentially means we're going to have to be looking at what species we can plant here in the region into the future, taking into account the increased temperatures and potential droughts that we're going to be seeing. And so, is it difficult to hear me?
It is. It is.
Sorry, I'm trying to talk as loud as possible. Is that a little bit better?
That's better, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a number of other projects and assessments taking place with the agricultural community, and we continue to support the health unit as they undertake their regional climate change assessment as well. Our hope was to start a municipal workshop series in March, starting with an urban forestry and parks workshop, but unfortunately we had to cancel that because of COVID. And instead, I'm working with several municipalities, including the towns of Tecumseh, Lakeshore, Essex, and the city of Windsor on a number of projects. And we're continuing to identify opportunities for efficiencies, partnerships, and funding opportunities, everything from green infrastructure to electric vehicle charging throughout the region. Really, the balance of my time over the last several months has really been focused on the facilitation of the Essex County Regional Energy Plan. And so this project is being led by the County of Essex Project Working Team, and that includes departments of finance, planning, transportation, mapping, as well as representation from the Ontario Greenhouse and Vegetable Growers and Windsor Essex Development Corp. And it is been funded through the county as well as the Ministry of Energy and the 7 lower tier municipalities. So the consulting team for this project, which we've been very pleased with their progress so far, is the same team that the City of Windsor has used for their community energy plan. And that was on purpose to ensure synergies and alignment between our plans. And it is how's everybody, can you hear me? Still doing okay? Okay. And so the consulting team is composed of senior energy supply and integration consultants throughout the US and Germany, as well as municipal engagement experts in Ontario. And over the last 6 months, in partnership with municipalities and Enbridge Gas, Hydro One, Essex Power, and ELK, water usage data, natural gas and electricity data was collected for all municipal facilities, as well as residential, commercial, industrial buildings across the region. At that point, recognizing the scale of the greenhouse sector in the region, we thought it was appropriate to break them out into their own data group because of the implementation strategies for that sector will be very different for that group as opposed to, say, residential retrofits. So that data, the energy data, was then matched to MPAC data. So looking at the age of buildings, square footage, heating type at the community level for each of the 7 lower tier municipalities. And so the analysis for this project is very robust and it's very reliable and really provides a good baseline for how we're using energy and where our dollars are being spent on energy in this region. So earlier this week, we had the opportunity to present some initial baseline data in our first community task force meeting. And the community task force is made up of representatives from all municipalities, including the City of Windsor, Warden McNamara, regional energy providers, large industrial and commercial users, Libra Credit Union, Leamington Hospital, Indigenous partners, and others. And this group is intended to provide insight and expertise really relating to energy locally. So I did provide one graphic in the report that I provided, and this is just one sample of the preliminary data that data analysis that we're using to establish baseline for energy use and energy-related greenhouse gas emissions across the region. And I think when we presented it to the community task force, I think there was some surprise perhaps or some about, where the bulk of our emissions in the region are coming from. And in total, about 40% of the region, the greenhouse gases in the region are coming from the greenhouses. And transportation accounts for about 30%. And then our residential units account for about 15% of the emissions. So while this is perhaps a bit surprising, the consultants at the time when they were talking to the community task force, and what I want to make clear tonight as well, is that this is data and there's no judgment behind this. And it's truly an indication of a successful and an important business in our community. But it's also an indication that there's opportunities. And I think that that's similar to the City of Windsor and what they've identified through their plan, that where you see large sectors with high emissions, there's an opportunity to become leaders in the field of energy efficiency and opportunities to acquire some federal funding to support those, whether it's smaller growers to become more energy efficient or invest in regional and municipal transit. So currently the community task force is beginning to look at a vision and targets for the plan. And the region, they're using guiding principles of energy, environment, economy, and reliability. So as you'll see outlined in the report, these goals aren't just about cutting emissions, it's about creating jobs and ensuring reliable sources of energy for all sectors into the future. So, and I also just wanted to note that there will be public engagement opportunities throughout the plan. And we're still trying to figure out what that might look like in the age of COVID. But the County of Essex is in the process of putting together a website where this information will be hosted. And just recognizing that successful implementation of an energy plan really relies on fostering a greater level of understanding of energy usage within the community. And here's where we can also benefit from the work the city has done and the media coverage of their efforts. So this is a very big project and it's moving very quickly all of a sudden. I think some partners may have been surprised or thought that COVID could really delay progress on this. But in fact, it's really highlighted the importance of accelerating the project. And those are for all the reasons that Richard mentioned during his earlier report, and the fact that we expect that there will be funding coming down from the federal government to support initiatives related to energy efficiency and energy management regionally. So given that, the report recommends that ERCA encourage the County of Essex and municipal partners to accelerate the development of this plan in order to take advantage of possible stimulus funding opportunities. And with that, I just wanted to thank the board this evening and our municipal partners for working with us on this project. I think it's exciting and a really exciting way to move forward in partnership with the region on some really important climate action.
Thank you, Claire. Any questions, board members? Okay, Claire just basically read the motion, the administrative recommend motion. So I'm not going to repeat it. I'll just ask folks to, if we do have a mover for the administration's recommendation. I see Ms. Morrison, seconded by Councillor Carrick. Do we have any opposition? Seeing none, that passes. Thank you, Claire. Okay, BD 1820, the 2020 capital project or capital project update. So despite COVID, there are a number of projects that ERCA has received funding for through grants or as a result of fundraising from the Conservation Foundation. Those projects are listed in the report. Kevin is still with us. He's able to respond to any questions you may have on those projects. Seeing none, I'm gonna hold off for one more second or two. No one has any questions on capital. I can't believe it. Okay. In that case, here's the motion that BD 1820 be received for members' information, and further that tenders will proceed in keeping with ERCA's purchasing policies. That's the administrative recommendation. Councillor Janice, seconded by Councillor Morley. Any opposed? Seeing none, that passes. The flood advisory program and high lake levels. Mr. Burney is going to enlighten us or update us on the lake levels and risks therein. Tim?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are, as we sit right now, probably about 0.75 meters above long-term average lake levels both in Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie. We've been very fortunate that like through the spring and early summer, we've been very dry conditions locally. However, outflows from the upper Great Lakes are coming by us, and we're going to exceed levels that we saw here locally last year. So we are going to establish a new high lake level, record level, both in Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie for this year.
Touchscreen's not responding the way I'm anticipating. Mr. Carrick, you have questions? Councillor Carrick, excuse me.
That's fine. Thank you. Through you to Mr. Burney. Again, timelines at all, forecasts, remission, any idea? Because we all have areas that are low and they're already high. So as we get higher, to what extent and what length, if it's at all possible to guesstimate? Thank you.
Unfortunately, we are subject to outflows of the upper Great Lakes, and the upper Great Lakes now are anywhere from 1.55 to 1.35 of all-time record outflows. That's coming by us. We are most reactive locally, though, to rainfall events over the western basin of Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair. Through this, late spring, early summer, though, systems have been splitting and running to the north and south of us. So we've not had any measurable amounts of rainfall. But outflows from the upper Great Lakes are still basically establishing for us our baseline that establishes where we are at for monthly averages. Our monthly average in May exceeded all-time record high of last year. And we are going to meet and or exceed significantly the June peak that we observed in 2019.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Carrick. Any other questions for Mr. Burney? Ms. Morrison?
Has there been any talk at all with the high water levels about from the ministry about changing the setbacks from water courses and wetlands? Do you know that, Tim?
Our I shut off my video because it's affecting our signal.
Okay.
Our requirements
we have,
locally, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Our requirements locally with respect to setbacks and elevation are determined based on provincial minimum standard requirements.
Right.
Fortunately, historically, we applied a freeboard to those protection levels, but they are still minimum protection levels that were established. As we go through this period of time, we are recording the impact of those levels, and we are assessing exactly what that is happening with respect to those levels and trying to project in the long term what we need to provide for minimum standards.
Mm-hmm.
So the province has no impact on us right now with respect to what our current standards are, what our current minimum levels are, what our current minimum setbacks are.
Okay, well, it's just with the flooding and the high water tables and everything that's going on, I would think that the standards need to change.
If I may, Mr. Chair, the flood advisor that was appointed last year by the government, as well as the flooding strategy that was introduced earlier this year, did acknowledge that perhaps it's time to take a look at the standards and review and evaluate what those standards might mean so that we can then apply those mechanisms that Tim described. So that is a recommendation that's in the flooding strategy. It's not acted on right now, but it is one that we've included, for instance, in some of our discussions with partners around what are some of the priorities that we need to address. In terms of, the extension of that is looking at hazard mapping. Of course, we've started a project right now with the county that's beginning to identify where are some of the priorities and what are the priorities from a hazard mapping perspective. We know an estimate of what that's going to cost. It's an $18 million 5-year program. And it's one of those programs that we would look to see how we could maybe access that funding from the federal and provincial governments, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of green stimulus. So municipalities in the county are really on board with this. We've been working a little bit more even with Chatham-Kent and Lower Thames Conservation Authority in keeping with the recommendations from the flood advisor and flooding strategy. And so these are the types of things that we are believing need to be reviewed and need to be evaluated and updated where they can be.
I just worry that with what's going on right now with the high water table and the high water levels, that when, everybody down in this area, I guess Essex County, want growth because they see that as tax dollars and or assessment dollars. And I just worry that it'll be almost like shutting the door after the horses left the barn. Because I see more and more happening. And I know there's a group of people in Amherstburg who are just livid about some of the things that are going to happen that are close to Big Creek. And they feel that ERCA should be able to push them back further. And I have tried to tell them that without you know, the provincial guidelines and what the province puts forward. ERCA can only do so much. But anyway, that's.
If I may just quickly respond to that too, I do look at, and you know, Leamington as an example has initiated their shoreline management planning process, which is taking a look at some of these considerations. Lakeshore, Tecumseh are also going through that exercise. And we've been working with them, with City of Windsor as well on Little River. We've been working with them on that project as well. So there are some things that municipalities could do to get ahead of some of that work and do some of that assessment from a municipal perspective, and perhaps take a look at what some of the, you know, in Leamington example, they're looking at some of the priority areas that are a problem. Similar with Lakeshore and Tecumseh, there's some real issues that they're dealing with and need to address. So how we ultimately incorporate some of these things into a hazard map and hazard mapping exercise, that would be the next step. But certainly there's a lot to build on when it comes to what some of our municipal partners have already started.
Okay, if Mr. MacArthur is still there, I hope he's listening to this. Thank you. Or Councillor MacArthur.
Love it when I get that "you're screwing up on Zoom" message. Are there any further questions? Councillor Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just either to Richard or Tim, further to what Marilyn was stating, I know talking through Tim that we as councillors, just from an educated perspective, we have a lot of powers with our OPs, zoning amendments, things like that. I agree with Marilyn that everyone wants to live near the water. Everyone wants to live near nature. With the high water levels, the secondary floodplains, the 150-foot setback provision, the minimum, and that as an authority, that's all we are able to enforce or recommend when municipalities seek recommendations from ERCA. Is there anything that you can pass on to us with recommendations? I know the mapping is going to specify maybe further setback requirements, but our OP's coming up. We've got an environmental committee that we're putting in place here that I'm hopefully going to be a part of. I just want to know what we as councillors can do within our own municipalities through guidance and recommendations through this authority to create bigger green spaces and buffer zones. And Tim, I know you alluded to it, that we have a lot of power as a municipality above and beyond the province to modify and change our zones and create bigger buffers. Is there anything that you can recommend?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are going through a process with all of our local municipalities within the region, updating their official plans to comply with PPS. There are areas that currently are inhabited that unfortunately we have to plan in the future that with rising lake levels, rising problems associated with hazards, that may find that those areas are not suitable to be inhabited. That message is best dealt with through long-range planning and through our official plan processes to identify that for people who are anticipating buying in certain areas or potentially developing in certain areas, that message is given in advance of them acquiring lands and anticipating they're going to develop. That's with respect to strictly hazards. With respect to natural heritage values, a similar issue or a similar consideration should be applied as natural heritage needs to be buffered from development. We can't continuously look at, try to stick a house in a woodlot, try and stick a house in an island and a wetland, because we see what happens to that type of concept right now when we've got increased hazard levels affecting it.
Councillor Courtney, are you good?
Yeah, I think so. I guess just in reference to OPs and things like that, is there anything that the authority, Tim, with your knowledge, and Richard, that I would be seeking any advice, obviously, as a councilor in the town of Amherstburg, and I don't know, it would be up to the other councilors, but to seek advice on what you would like to see before it actually becomes mandated by the province, or is there anything, would that be out of line? Would it be, just guidance that we could take and as a municipality move forward and make decisions on as council?
We thank you, Mr. Chair, through you, Mr. Chair. We are actively engaged right now with your staff and providing the advice currently on how to deal with and resolve issues as it relates to PPS, current PPS, and making those recommendations.
If I may, there are a couple of tools that have been developed, right? We've built the Essex Region Natural Heritage System Strategy, which does provide some recommendations as it relates to natural heritage, as an example. The Big Creek Management Plan provides recommendations as it relates to heritage hazards and water quantity. So there are some of those pieces already that your administration is already reviewing and incorporating into that plan. It might be a way to ensure that those recommendations are being considered. And again, those are the tools that we use when we're providing that advice, whether it be to the county or to municipalities.
Perfect. So I will be in consultation with administration on these recommendations. It seems to be a loophole that you're talking to administration. I just want to make sure that all the information gets passed on. I know we receive it as the authority here. I just want to make sure that we as council are brought up to speed so we know what your recommendations are. And again, there's development's hot and heavy still right now, even with the pandemic. And again, everybody's after the crown jewels, getting near naturalized areas and water. So I just want to make sure to protect moving forward, setbacks, recommended increased setbacks, things like that, whatever, keep us in the loop if possible. And thank you.
If I may, Mr. Chair, unfortunately, we all have to deal with historic planning processes and historic development processes that we are attempting to manage. As we move through time with those, and as official plans and other things are actually updated, development things take place while we're waiting for approvals, while we're waiting for other processes to meet and coalesce. And so during those periods of time, there's going to be like differences with respect to what some ratepayers interpret that they should be able to do on their properties. However, the long and short of it is basically we've been charged with the responsibility to ensure people are protected, ensure that their development is sustainable, and ensure that the municipality does not assume any liability. The trouble is where we're at in a place and time right now is many for years, for decades, have not listened. And we are now reaping that whirlwind. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Burney. Before I go on, just want to welcome Deputy Mayor Bailey. Thank you for joining us. I know you were in the middle of another meeting, but just still grinding away today, I see, and here with us this evening. Thank you. And I did notice that Deputy Mayor Becchetti was trying to join. He might be having some connectivity issues, but hopefully he'll be able to join us as he was in another meeting as well at some point later on in the meeting. Are there any further questions for Mr. Burney on his report? Seeing none, once again, we do have a administration recommendation that BD 2019/20 be received for members' information, and further that ERCA continue to work with municipalities to address hazards across the region. Can we get a mover, or I'll look for direction on that?
I'll move it to Mr. Chair.
Councillor Morrison, seconded by Councillor Courtney. Any opposed? Seeing none, that passes. Okay, BD 2020, Statement of Operating Activities for the 5 months ended May 31st. I think that's I don't know that I don't see a report there. That's just a receive for information. Can I get a motion to receive? Councillor Jobin, Deputy Mayor Verbicki. Anyone opposed? Seeing none. Thank you. That passes. Environmental registry reports for comments. Again, this is correspondence for information only. I would note that the changes to this regulation were to take effect beginning June 1st. The province has delayed that until January to reduce any administrative burden on municipalities. Do I need a motion on this? As a, by the way, I'm not, I guess I'm asking. Rich.
Sure. No, we sort of put it forward just as a resource for members' information. It isn't really anything that we need to act on. It's just part of a review that was done through Conservation Ontario.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So that's for members' information. So moving on, we have the Watershed Management Services Activity Report, BD 2120. We don't have a verbal report there, but this again is a receive for information. Unless, does anyone have any comments or questions on this? Seeing none, direction. Councillor Sleeman, I assume you want to move the administration's report. Thank you. And seconded by Councillor Lucier. Any opposed? And that passes. And oh, there we go. Deputy Mayor Becchetti has joined us. Thank you very much. I know we, as I mentioned earlier, when Deputy Mayor Bailey joined us, I know you were in another meeting, so thank you for extending your day into well into the evening and being with us here. We are at, just for your information, coming up to the correspondence section. Actually, where are we in the agenda?
Yeah,
we're just about to move into committee of the whole.
Correspondence first, Mr. Chair. We do have one piece of correspondence or a couple of pieces of correspondence first.
Oh, excuse me. Yes, still under section 13 C, and there's a series of reports or correspondence that Richard is going to comment on. So take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I will keep this brief. While COVID and everything else has certainly been occupying a lot of our time, there are still back discussions going on within ministries around the Conservation Authorities Act, around some of the regulations and some of the potential changes to the Act that I know we've talked about before as a board. I wanted to put forward the following correspondence, I guess, is put forward just as information to members that there has been some activities, I guess, with AMO, with some of the other partners out there across Ontario that have sort of suggested that while everyone is dealing with COVID right now, maybe this isn't the right time to make any more changes to the Act. Let's let conservation authorities continue doing the work that they're doing until we get a handle on this. It may not be the top of mind for municipalities to want to or need to negotiate things like memorandums of understanding around programs and services while they're preoccupied and focused on dealing with the post-COVID pandemic and the post-COVID plan. So I just wanted to bring that, highlight that as, in terms of what those correspondence pieces are saying. We certainly are continue to be interested in what activities or what the direction the province may be taking with the Act and through ourselves and conservation authorities in Ontario. We are very interested in certainly continuing to have those dialogues and have that discussion with the ministry as it relates to some of the things even we talked about this evening.
Thank you, Richard. Do we, any questions on this report? Okay, that's another receive for information. Can I get a mover on this? Councillor Desjardins, seconded by Deputy Mayor Bailey. Any opposed? Seeing none, that passes. Now, okay, so we are going to move into the committee of the whole. The way that I understand it, and I'll seek any clarification or ask Nicole to clarify anything I get wrong here. We're going to move into committee of the whole and then immediately adjourn the public meeting afterwards. So for those of you that are watching us live stream on YouTube, and I know that it's millions and millions of people across the globe, that we are essentially signing off. Yeah, that's right. That we're signing off at this point. This is essentially the end of our official business, aside from a formal vote to adjourn the meeting. So for those of you that have been watching and are with us, thank you for being with us this evening, and be well.